Hey guys, thanks for coming back with us. This is going to be episode 21. And as always, with myself, Corey, and such, all of our opinions here expressed our own. Such, how you doing?
I'm good, buddy, man. I'm good. It's Monday, ready to rock. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, don't tell people we're only recording 2 days before we're releasing this. It makes us seem like amateurs.
Hey, listen, we are amateurs. We're just starting this game, man. We need to figure it out. We need to progressively increase 1% better. So hopefully we'll do it on a Sunday next time.
That's the hope, anyways. Yeah, hope springs eternal, anyways.
Yeah.
So we had a few listener questions or answers, I should say, come up from our last time about what we wanted or what people wanted us to talk about. And again, they know we're not experts. I think they're just more interested in listening to other people talk about it. But one of the topics that was specific to a couple of people that we know from the Ruck and Rise podcast was to talk about grief. And immediately it seems like a very heavy topic, but I think there's some facets there that we can talk about. Now, when you hear grief, you think, at least I do, anyways, the fact that it's a loss of a loved one. But I know we were talking in the green room, and it was also grief at the loss of identity, the loss of what could have been, and not necessarily the loss of a particular person. Thoughts on that before we kind of start?
Yeah. I think, look, man, grief's a feeling, right? And anyone, I think, if you're thinking along those lines, you can feel grief with pretty much anything that you're really attached to and something that you're connected with. So I don't think it necessarily has to be a loved one, but obviously, a passing of a loved one, the grief associated to it is next level. But again, like you said, identity, transitioning out of a career into another career, grief, you can grieve anything, as many of us do.
Hmm. I think what we'll do is we'll start off with the idea of the loss of a loved one. And I just wanted to read something here. As most podcasters do, we search on Google for something that's meaningful. But Orson Scott Card, who's an author that I've read a few of his books, had a quote from the book Shadow of the Giant. And it said, "Life is full of grief to exactly the degree we allow ourselves to love other people." And I've heard this before where grief is the price that you pay for loving other people in your life. If you're not experiencing grief, then there's a chance that you haven't put yourself out to love. And I'm not so sure I agree with the second part of that, but certainly the first part of it. What are your thoughts on that?
Hmm. I mean, it sounds like it makes sense. I mean, when you grieve, there's a process of like, again, I'm speaking for myself here. So like, I've grieved many times throughout my life, and I'm thinking, what was, why was I feeling sad? Why was I feeling whatever those feelings were, grief associated to it? And yeah, I think it had to do with love and connection and
Hmm.
um, when it came to people, anyways, and not and the finite understanding of that were so I'll explain what I'm saying here. I have a high school friend of mine, really close to me, one of my best friends, to be honest. And I went to high school in Texas in the United States, and I didn't have a ton of friends. And he was one of my first friends when I moved there, and we were on the wrestling team together, and we had many, many times where we connected over the mats and then tournaments and all these types of things.
Hmm.
And after high school, a few years after, people move and do their things in life, and we still kind of connected from time to time. But there were a few years where we hadn't. But my connection to him was still pretty. I get emotional just thinking about him. So it was really a valuable relationship for me. And I got wind about 5 or 6 years ago that he was killed in a home invasion and
Hmm.
in New York City. So everyone in the home, it was like five buddies that were, housemates there, and all of them were killed.
Hmm.
And so, man, that affected me. I didn't even realize how it affected me, but it did.
Hmm.
Even though we hadn't had a conversation for a few years. And I believe I felt all kinds of grief. I was holding it in. There were days, I'm cool, whatever. And then as soon as I would start talking about the experience and what had happened, I'd break down.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think for me, it was a good understanding of what grief is, and when it came to losing someone that I truly cared for, and then kind of was raised with, like, it was my
Right.
first kind of person I knew that I was tight with that, and it was, I guess, the how it all happened. That was also, an upsetting thing, and then
For sure. Yeah.
um, what else was there? I think another grief or experience of grief in that was like, man, I didn't get to talk to him. I didn't get to tell him how I felt about him. I
Hmm.
hadn't had those opportunities for many years, and there was a level of guilt associated too, right? And I was like, man,
Right.
I could have been a better friend, or whatever, all these types of things. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
grief, I think, okay, this might sound strange, but I'm, I don't know if happy is the right word, but I am good with the experience of having that feeling, because I didn't really quite understand until that happened what what grief is and how you can move through it, and then and how you can hopefully overcome it. But anyways, yeah, that's my first thoughts on grief. Right when we were talking about it, I thought of him. So
Yeah, and something that's super powerful, right? Like he's not necessarily an immediate family. He's not somebody you were in a relationship with or anything like that. But it's somebody who meant something. It was significant in your life. And so while I use the word, grief is the price that you pay for having love for somebody, I think it can be expanded. I think it can go out from that as to what you said, which was connections and those sort of things. I mean, not to divert too far from loved ones and stuff like that, but think of a pet. Think of something that you've had since a child, and that pet's no longer with you. They pass away, and the sheer level of grief that you feel for that connection being lost because of them being a part of your life. I have an older dog. She's 12 now, and I can start seeing her slowing down and stuff like that. But she's been there the entirety of my girls' lives, and I know it's going to hit them. I know it's going to be hard, and I can see it coming. Um, but I wouldn't take away that experience from them of having that, um, dog in their life for anything. I know it's gonna come with a massive price tag. It's gonna come with a cost, but the amount that they get every day is worth it in my opinion.
yeah, I mean, that's the cost. What is the cost? And is it worth the cost? Man, I would argue, yeah, for sure, man. Because, and look, there's so many other things we can talk about. I want to stay on Ali, my friend, for a minute
Hmm.
here. But like, without him in my life, like, there's so many things I can reflect back on, the fun times, the experiences. He was Persian. He was from Iran, his family. And man, I didn't know what Persian food was until I went to his house. And then I know all about Persian food now because I hung out with his family and his brother and like his sister, like all these like experiences through the connection of a high school friend.
Hmm.
And then so, and also the friends that we've made together. I'm still in contact with a couple of those friends, man. That's been more than 30 years ago, man.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
I was just talking to one of our other buddies, Upteen. He's another Persian guy. He's out of he lives in New York, but he bounces back and forth from Dallas, Fort Worth to New York. He's a hedge fund analyst and he works on Wall Street, and he's kind of a big deal in that space. And he's starting a podcast, and
Hmm.
he's like, "Oh man, I wanted you on my podcast first time." But point being is this, man, I'm still talking to the guy, and that's another dude that I went to high school with. So it's man, these connections, they're so worth it. Yes, when negative things happen or someone pass away, yeah, for sure, man. It's a kick in the junk, but all those experiences from it, man, I wouldn't give them up for the world.
Now I know we all experience grief individually. You in the death of your friend. Me and in the death of some of my family members. I don't come from a very large family. I mean, I have a large extended family, but generally everybody was fairly small. It was a very sort of tight knit, small portion of my family that I'm used to. So I've been, I mean, depending on how you look on it, I've been lucky in that I haven't had to experience grief as much for really intimate family members. Um, but we all experience it differently, and I think that there's no right way to experience grief. And I know I've seen it at funerals and things like that where people will get upset at other people because they're not expressing grief in the same way and they seem very casual about it. But I think that that has to do with more with operating day by day and sort of getting through it than it is assigning a meaning or a value as to the person's impact on your life.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you brought that up, I thought of another friend of mine um, in that regard. So, like in terms of like people responding differently to grief and how they interact with that. So again, we're going back to high school days, and I was probably in and around 17-ish, right? And another friend of mine, uh, close friend at the time, had a younger brother. So we're both in, grade 11, 12, whatever it was. I think grade 12. And he had a younger brother that was 11. So we were living in Plano, Texas at the time, and his house was, they'd had alleyways, kind of like how you have nowadays, like the alleyways, and then you park in the back of the house and the garage, this, that, and the other.
Mhm.
So his younger brother was playing basketball outside, and the ball got away from him, and he was running towards to catch it, right, to get it. Head first, kind of leaning forward, and then a car hit him
Ugh.
and killed him instantly.
Mhm.
And so his uh, his dad at the time was a consultant, so his dad was traveling somewhere consulting,
Mhm.
and his mom was at work, so it was he and I that you know um, had to take him to the hospital and go through that whole process. But he he was pretty put together, right? Like he wasn't in that moment, yeah, he was freaking out. But the subsequent days and couple weeks after his funeral, all these things that were associated to it, he was holding it together because his parents weren't, right?
Mhm.
And I think, some people might have looked at him and been like, hey, man, like this guy's, doesn't seem to care or whatever. But he very much did. And I can explain how I know for a fact. My friend at the time, Raymond, his name was, his younger brother was Neil. And his younger brother was a standout, smart as hell, really good at school, like all the things. And his parents really not babied him, almost put him up above my friend Raymond, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because Raymond was a shit rat.
Mhm.
He used to
Mhm.
steal cars. He used to mess around. He used to, do all stupid shit, right?
Mhm.
And sneak out of the house, like all these kind of things, right? So his parents were always giving him the grief, right?
Mhm.
And as soon as all that happened, man, his life flipped the script. And he started studying, went to university, ended up going to SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas, got his undergraduate in biochemistry. Then he got into Harvard Medical School, became a doctor, and then he became a cardiologist and one of the top cardiologists in Texas because his younger brother wanted to be a cardiologist.
Mhm.
So, I mean, people respond differently, man. I mean, you can't really judge how someone interacts and how they feel a certain thing. Let them do their thing and see how things manifest through time.
I know with my personal experience through my job as a first responder, I have legitimately probably been to a couple hundred deaths of several different forms. Usually it just comes in the form of what we call a sudden death, which is just somebody passes away and it's not necessarily because of a violent act or anything like that. And we have to go to every single one of those. And so I get to be with people, um, you know, at the end of their life in some cases, and afterwards, and dealing with the family particularly is always quite interesting because how do I, as a stranger, assist them in the end of something. It's probably going to be one of the most intense points in their life. They've never probably dealt with it before. Sometimes people who are older have dealt with it with other family members, but it's always really interesting because I don't want to insert myself into the situation any more than I need to, because I want to give people space to do things. But obviously, there's a job that I have to do and certain things that have to be done. But comforting people is something that I didn't expect I would necessarily need to do nor be good at. And it's interesting because I'm a stranger standing in their house, and they almost feel obligated at that point to engage me in conversation. And I want to ease their pain somehow. I want to make the situation better. I got into this job to help people, and to just stand there stoically doesn't seem like it's helping anybody at any particular point. Often, when we're dealing with people who have a loved one of several years, I think of an elderly couple. I've been, unfortunately, to several of those where the partner is sitting there, and they always ask, like, what do I do now? And I try to explain to them and talk to them. But one of the best things that I can ever tell anybody, especially when we're talking about how you deal with grief, is however you deal with it, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So if you don't feel like crying, don't. If you feel like crying, if you feel like gnashing, if you feel like throwing yourself on the ground, then do that. And don't beat yourself up for feeling that way or not feeling that way, because your body's processing it in whatever you can, in whatever way you can. And like I said, I've seen people, like I said, wailing away, throwing themselves on the ground, and I've seen people sort of sit there and thank me. And if I have to come and tell them that a loved one has died, maybe it's not right there. We do next of kin notifications quite frequently, unfortunately, and often we don't have a whole lot of answers because another agency has reached out and said, "Hey, this person lives in your area. You need to tell them that their son or daughter has died, or their mom or dad has died." And we don't have a lot of information, but we're going to be responsible for trying to provide that information to them. And I've actually had people thank me, but then say they felt bad for me because I had to have the burden of telling them. And I'm thinking, what are you talking about? Like, I'm telling you, your son has died, and you're comforting me. And I think that's that way that they express grief, at least at that time, is that they still feel like the provider, the caretaker, and if they can't do it for their son or daughter, then they're going to do it for me, because they see that counterpoint and that connection.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, man? Maybe, I mean, the first thing that popped in my head just now when you were saying that they're comforting you is like maybe you also needed it too.
Hmm.
Because, I mean, man, I'm just trying to put myself in your shoes and how that would be to be able to tell a family member, man, that's tough, man. And I can imagine how I would feel. I would have to put a wall up to be able to deliver that information because if I was being organic and authentic to who I am, man, I probably wouldn't be able to do it well. I'd probably have some emotional response, maybe even engage in some of the heartfelt tears. I mean, you're feeling that emotion, man. And it's those emotions are really powerful. If someone's feeling them, man, I can feel them. So maybe there could have been some opportunities where they saw something in you and they're like, hey, man, it's okay. And they're trying to comfort you. Who knows? But
Well,
I think it's a very difficult thing. And the thing that I was actually thinking when you were bringing these things up
mm,
is like, how do you navigate when it's questionable how the person had passed away, but you don't know for certain? So you have to, okay, we have to ask a few questions that may be uncomfortable now, um, even though that they may be grieving. That makes sense?
yeah, it does. I mean, obviously, there's a process involved, and the first point of any process, whether or not something is expected or unexpected in a death, is to let somebody know. They need to know this. They need to start making arrangements, regardless of what the situation is. But in my job, there's certain things that we can say and certain things that we don't say, especially at that beginning stage. Obviously, people are told everything by the appropriate people at the appropriate time when they need to. But me standing, on your
Mm,
doorstep or stepping inside your front door is not necessarily going to be that time.
right.
It's not necessarily my job at that particular point. And like I said, I often don't know the details of what happened. I might have a very general idea and maybe a contact person to speak to, but that's generally about it when we're doing that. And it's funny, as you said, like, how do you do that? Like, how you don't think you could do it? I'll tell you right now, after probably delivering a couple hundred of these, I still don't know what the right way of doing it is. And you said like you would get tied up in the emotion of things, and it's not being so stoic that you deliver the news and then walk out the door and have that barrier up and not let it affect you and move on to the next thing. But it's also not being so emotional that you're unable to deliver what you need to deliver. As interesting as it sounds, one of the things they teach us in training is to use very plain language when explaining that somebody has
Mm,
died, and using that particular word. And it's a hard, harsh word to use. But the idea is because if you say that somebody got hurt really badly, immediately people are going to think, okay, well, they're still okay, or they've passed away. And it's like, well, what do you mean they passed away? Like they're still alive. And I've even had people argue with me when I've said, this loved one of yours has died. And they're like, no, they haven't. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I was there when this happened. They did die. And they're like, no, nope, they'll be coming home. So the way that people, like I said, that immediate shock and everything else, I don't think there is a right way of doing it. We try to train for it. We try, we take courses on it, empathy. We have people come in and talk to us about being able to deliver that in an effective way, but a sensitive way, I think, is probably the easiest way. So not overly emotional, not overly stoic, but somewhere in between where you're sensitive. Um, but I'll tell you right now, after a couple hundred of these, if you let them get to you, it overwhelms you. Because I'm
yeah,
dealing
for
with
sure.
200 family members' deaths that aren't mine.
Mm,
I was at an inquest on a death that had nothing to do with me, but I happened to have dealings with this person, and I turned to the family members, and I said, we often deal with death in our job, and I said, there are people that come into our lives that become part of us, and I said, I will take your son with me on my journeys moving forward. And they broke down, and afterwards they came up and they were hugging me and they were thanking me, and I think it gave them closure. To me, maybe it wasn't the most professional thing to say, but it was the sensitive thing to say because I
mm.
felt it. So yeah,
I
I,
mean,
I don't think
listen,
there's a good way of doing it. I don't think there's a right way of doing it.
no, and it makes sense, man. That plain language thing really resonates with me because, again, I'm reflecting back and I've been when, I'm walking into the hospital, right, where my friend is, and clearly his brother's dead, right?
Hmm.
And and even still, I was delusion, like I was in denial. It's crazy. So like
Hmm.
so back in they had a pastor come out with him because they had to let him know. And so I was walking into the entrance of the ER and he was walking out, my friend. He was crying at that time because that's the first time he was notified that his brother was dead.
Yeah.
And but when he came out, the pastor told me, and I was like, yeah, so how is he doing? I was like, how is he? He's like, didn't you hear me? He's dead. I was like, so even for me, man, I couldn't reconcile that. I was like, what?
Hmm.
That makes no sense.
Yeah.
But it's such a finite thing that it's it's hard. It was hard for me to understand at that time.
Well, how do you understand the absence of something? So something has been a constant in your life, whether or not they've been right there and you've been with them. The idea being they were here and now they're not here. And how does your body reconcile, or how does your mind reconcile the fact that this is never going to be a thing anymore? What I have are memories and the past. How does the body reconcile that? How does the mind reconcile that? And I think that's where obviously grief comes in, is that's that process of reconciling it. And they'll talk about the 7 stages of grief and all the rest of it. I don't think we necessarily need to get into them here,
No.
but there's a excuse me, there's a physical and a mental process that is grief that they've broken down into scientific terms. But it's that understanding that the absence will continue, I think, is the easiest way to put it.
Yeah, and I think look, this is how I think now. This is what my brain goes to performance and how to do it better. And this may sound crude or whatever, but I guess how does one become a little bit more resilient to these things? I guess starting young, man, having pets, having those conversations when things happen. When a pet passes away, you have that conversation with your child, and so they can feel and navigate through that process. And then hopefully over time, it's never going to be perfect, but you'll have an understanding of what needs to happen in order to um, get to the other side of things.
Mhm.
And I think maybe, it sounds so weird, experiencing it at a smaller level to help fortify yourself so that in the future, when you're older, when those things happen, you're not floored by them. That you're able to still navigate. Yeah, you're feeling it, you're upset, you're sad, all the things and grieving, but you can still walk through that. And I think during those times for me, when I've had those massive grief moments, even now, grief from, transitioning out of a career into a different space,
Mhm.
identity issues, all these different things, it's another way, I think, this is how I frame it. It's another way for me to build mental resilience and capacity so I can navigate these things and be able to be stronger at the other side of them.
I think it's less about having how hard the grief hits you initially, but how you navigate it moving forward, I think, is kind of what I'm hearing. I know that, like for instance, you were an avid jujitsu guy, and I could read about jujitsu out of 7 different books, watch a bunch of YouTube videos on it, and think, okay, I've got a real understanding of what jujitsu is until I put on the gi and I go on the mat, and all of a sudden everything's out the window. And I think that's really similar when it comes to grief, is that, yeah, I can prepare myself, I can prepare my kids, I can read up on it, we can have discussions on it. And then the minute it happens, it's like everything flushes. And it's not about necessarily the ability to ride the initial issue, but it's recognizing things and, like you said, being better on the back end, and doing better for yourself and doing better for those around you. And again, there's no good way or bad way of dealing with grief. I think it's highly individual. And I think people are often way too tough on themselves, which keeps them in whatever stage of grief that they're in, because they're ashamed. They're embarrassed by the way they're doing it. They feel like they should be tougher. They feel like they should be better. And I don't think you need to put a quantitative idea on that as to what you should and shouldn't do. I think moving through it is a very fluid thing. But that being said, also understand that grief can try to hold you down. It can try to pull you back. It can keep you in one spot because it becomes your new normal and your new comfortable. And I know that seems atrocious to say, that somebody who's grief stricken is comfortable in it. It's just, it's familiar and you live in that. And the problem is when people start being concerned about you, is that you don't ever progress past that point. You say, I can't. This person was the loved one. I think of, my daughter's passing away. How would I ever move past that? And I don't think you ever do, but I think that you honor them by moving forward. You're never
Hmm.
past it, but you move forward
You
for
can,
them.
yeah, 100%. I think that makes a ton of sense, man. Like, you want to almost use their memory to do better things. Use, and use it as, I don't want to say use it. Understand that they'd want you to live a happier life. They understand that they'd want to have you live a fulfilled life. Understand that they'd want you to be connected into the community. Understand that they'd want you to service the community, however that looks, right? So
Hmm.
not just, forgetting it, but understanding what they would want for you,
Hmm.
and then using that to help propel you further to help others, or whatever you want to do, right? But whatever the it could be just your small, like your family, right?
Hmm.
Someone passes away. Okay, you're feeling everything, you're going through the grief process, but then you're also remembering the individual that has passed, so you can move forward with a positive perspective because you're trying to raise them up. At least that's how I would want to do. I would want to live my life in a way that, okay, man, this thing happened. I wanna do something good here so that I can have that piece of my friend, and whatever I'm doing, they're part of it too.
And you get to take that piece of your friend and you get to put that into everything that you're doing. You get to make them, even though they're absent in your life now, you get to make them a part of your present and your future. And you get to they get to be a part of that through you. I think again, back to two of the most important things in my life, my daughters. Even though I would want them to still love me if I passed away, I wouldn't want them to be stuck there. I'd want them to be healthy. I'd want them to be happy. I'd want them to be able to love other people. And just because they can't love me physically, by hugging me and telling me they love me and all the rest of it, to still have me there. But I would want them to have full, happy, healthy lives. And I can't think of anything more. And I'd be sad if I thought that um, their grief of me passing away was somehow holding them back.
Yeah, I have a
So,
question for you actually on that.
mm,
Um, so obviously we'd want our kids to love us, right? And things of that nature. But I think I've started thinking about it differently. Not that I don't want my daughter to love me. That's amazing to have that love.
mhm,
But I don't care. I want to make sure that she's good. So if I don't receive anything out of that, doesn't matter. So if and this was something I was tackling with when I was going through my divorce, in the sense of,
mhm,
oh, but I want to be able to do this, or I want to be able to provide this, or I want to have this thing. And I started realizing, I was like, man, who cares? As long as she's getting all the things that she needs. If it's grandma doing it, if it's her mom doing it, if it's a cousin doing it, who cares? It. I need to, or I started thinking about detaching myself to a certain degree from the emotional aspect, and I just want to make sure that all the things that she needs are there. If she
mhm,
reciprocates with love and affection, fine, that's bonus.
mhm,
But the
mhm.
end result is a productive member of society that's serving and that's independent and that's doing all the things that they need to do. I hope that makes sense.
And that's your expression of love to her,
Hmm.
is wanting the best for her, even if you don't get anything back from it,
Hmm.
right? And I think to tie it back to the grief, I think that's exactly what we're talking about. That idea that we want what's best for everybody, our expression of love, because we're not going to be able to get anything back because we're not going to be here anymore. So I
Hmm.
think I think it ties in beautifully. I think it's a fantastic thought. All right, Satch, we're a little bit at time here. I know a little bit heavy, and we've only sort of scratched the surface on this. Hopefully, Dave and Allie will get something out of this. But any final thoughts before we go?
No, yeah, like you said, man, it's a heavy one, but it doesn't have to be. Um, you know, take step by step, one day at a time. Think of the positive things of those people in your lives and use them to help uplift them and those around you.
And talk about it. Talk about it while you can. It's
Hmm.
tough. It sucks, but man, it doesn't get any easier when you're not there. But think about all the good stuff. Plan for the good stuff, even if you're not going to be there, and do your best for those around you. All right, guys. I think we're all done with this episode. A bit of a heavy one, but we appreciate you coming along, and hopefully you'll see us next week. See you
See ya.
guys.